What if everything you believe about attraction is only the surface story? Why do some younger women seem naturally drawn to older men? Not for money, not for looks, not for status, but for something far deeper that most people never notice. The truth is, attraction is not always conscious. It operates in silent psychological layers, shaped by security signals, emotional maturity, perceived stability, and unconscious behavioral cues we rarely talk about. And here's the twist. What looks like interest on the outside is often something completely different happening inside the mind. Because human attraction doesn't always follow age, it follows psychology. Have you ever noticed something strange in human behavior that nobody really explains clearly, yet you see it happening all the time? A glance, a smile, a moment between two people that seems simple on the surface, but somehow carries a deeper meaning underneath. And when it comes to attraction, especially between younger women and older men, most people rush to the easiest explanation. They assume it's about money, looks, or social status. But psychology tells a very different story. One that is far more subtle, far more unconscious, and honestly, far more human than most people are ready to admit. Because attraction does not begin where most people think it does. It does not begin in appearance. It begins in the nervous system. The brain is constantly scanning for signals long before logic gets involved. It is looking for safety, emotional predictability, and behavioral consistency. And sometimes, older men, without even realizing it, carry signals that the mind interprets as calm stability, not excitement, not fantasy, but something deeper, a feeling of emotional grounding in a chaotic world. This is where the real misunderstanding begins. People assume attraction is loud, obvious, and visual. But in reality, some of the strongest psychological pulls are quiet. A steady tone of voice, a patient response instead of a reactive one, the ability to remain composed in uncertainty. These are not dramatic traits, but to the subconscious mind, they are powerful indicators of emotional maturity. And emotional maturity in human psychology often translates into perceived safety. But there is another layer that goes even deeper. The brain is heavily influenced by familiarity bias. It does not always choose what is new or exciting. In many cases, it leans toward what feels stable, predictable, and easy to process. Older men often carry life patterns that are less chaotic, less impulsive, and more structured. To an observing mind, especially one still exploring emotional patterns, this creates a sense of psychological order. And the mind naturally leans toward order without even asking for permission. Now, here is where things become even more interesting. What we call interest or attention is not always what it appears to be. A smile, for example, is not a single emotional signal. It can be curiosity, comfort, recognition, or even subconscious acknowledgement of emotional presence. Sometimes a person smiles not because of attraction in the romantic sense, but because their brain has registered something unusual yet safe in another person's energy, something steady, something different from the emotional noise they are used to. And this is where nonverbal communication becomes more powerful than words. Humans are constantly reading microsignals: tone, pacing, pauses, eye contact, and emotional restraint. A person who does not overreact, who does not rush, who does not try to force emotional outcomes, often creates a psychological space where the other person feels more in control of their own emotions. And ironically, that sense of control can increase emotional openness. But perhaps the most misunderstood layer is this. Attraction is not always about desire. Sometimes it is about psychological curiosity. The mind is drawn to what it cannot immediately categorize. When someone behaves with calm confidence that does not demand attention but naturally holds it, the brain begins to observe more closely. An observation can easily be mistaken for emotional interest, even when it is still in the early stages of cognitive processing. Over time, these small subconscious reactions build a narrative in the mind. Not a logical one, but an emotional one. And humans are far more influenced by emotional narratives than they realize. We think we are making choices consciously, but often we are simply following patterns our subconscious has already accepted as comfortable or intriguing. So when people ask why certain dynamics exist in attraction, they are often asking the wrong question. It is not about age. It is not about surface-level advantages. It is about psychological signals that bypass logic and speak directly to emotional perception. It is about stability being noticed in a world that feels unstable. It is about calmness standing out in a world of emotional noise. And once you understand this, you start to see human behavior differently. You stop interpreting surface actions as final truths and instead begin to recognize the invisible layers underneath them. Because attraction was never just about what we see. It has always been about what the mind quietly feels before it even thinks. And that changes everything. Have you ever been in a situation where someone's presence alone changed the way you felt inside, without them even trying to impress you? No big words, no dramatic actions, nothing flashy, just calmness. And suddenly your mind feels quieter too. This is not coincidence. This is psychology working in the background, shaping human attraction in ways most people never consciously notice. At the core of human behavior lies a survival-based system in the brain that is constantly scanning for one primary thing: safety. Before we ever evaluate beauty, status, or personality traits, the nervous system is already asking a silent question: am I safe here? And this question is not logical. It is emotional. It is instantaneous. It happens in milliseconds before conscious thought even forms. This is why emotional presence matters more than people realize. When someone carries inner calmness, their nervous system communicates something powerful without words. It signals stability. Not perfection, not dominance, not superiority, but stability. And in a world filled with unpredictability, emotional stability becomes deeply noticeable, even magnetic, because it reduces internal tension in others. Older men, in many social and psychological patterns, are often perceived through this lens of calm presence. Not because age itself creates attraction, but because life experience tends to shape emotional responses. Over time, people either become reactive to life's pressures or they learn to regulate their emotional energy. Those who develop regulation often project a kind of quiet steadiness, and that steadiness is what the subconscious mind registers first. To understand this deeper, imagine the human mind as a constantly running background program. It is always comparing present moments with past emotional experiences. When it detects familiarity and emotional safety, it relaxes. When it detects chaos or unpredictability, it becomes alert. This is not about logic. It is about nervous system conditioning. And attraction often begins exactly at that point of relaxation. This is why calm individuals often stand out without trying. Not because they are doing something attention-seeking, but because they are doing the opposite. They are not creating emotional spikes. They are not forcing reactions. They are not overwhelming the nervous system with unpredictability. Instead, they create space. And space, psychologically speaking, feels safe. Now, here is where it becomes even more interesting. The brain does not only respond to external behavior, it responds to emotional regulation. When someone speaks slowly, responds thoughtfully, and does not rush emotional exchanges, the listener unconsciously feels less pressured. This reduction in pressure creates comfort. And comfort is one of the earliest building blocks of emotional connection. But there is a deeper layer most people miss. Safety is not exciting on its own, but it becomes powerful when contrasted with emotional uncertainty. In environments where emotional reactions are intense, inconsistent, or unpredictable, calmness stands out even more. It becomes noticeable not because it demands attention, but because it removes internal noise. This is also why people sometimes feel drawn to individuals who seem emotionally anchored, not because they are perfect, but because they appear less controlled by external chaos. The subconscious mind interprets this as emotional reliability. And reliability at a psychological level is closely tied to trust-building mechanisms in the brain. Trust is not built through grand gestures. It is built through consistency, through tone, through presence, through the absence of unnecessary emotional volatility. And when trust begins to form at a subconscious level, the mind starts opening pathways that feel like curiosity, comfort, and emotional ease. These are the earliest stages of what people later label as attraction, even though the process started much earlier and much deeper. But perhaps the most important realization is this: people do not always respond to others directly. They respond to how they feel in their own nervous system around others. If someone makes them feel relaxed, their brain associates that person with emotional relief. And emotional relief is one of the most underrated forces in human connection. So when we talk about psychological safety, we are not talking about a concept that is abstract or distant. We are talking about something deeply biological, something that operates beneath personality, beneath intention, beneath surface-level interpretation. It is the invisible layer where human connection quietly begins. And once you understand this, you start realizing that attraction is not just about who stands out visually. It is about who the nervous system quietly relaxes around without needing a reason. Have you ever met someone who didn't do anything extraordinary, yet somehow stayed in your mind longer than expected? You can't quite explain it. They weren't the loudest in the room, they didn't try to impress anyone, but there was something about them that felt familiar, stable, almost mentally easy to be around. That feeling is not random. It is the brain quietly running one of its oldest systems, pattern recognition mixed with emotional prediction. The human mind is not built to chase chaos endlessly. It is built to reduce uncertainty. Every interaction we have is being processed through an invisible filter that asks, what is likely to happen next with this person? This is where familiarity bias begins to shape perception. We are not just reacting to people, we are predicting them. And what feels predictable often feels safe, even if we don't consciously realize it. This is where emotional patterns from life experience start to matter more than surface traits. People who have lived longer, faced more situations, and developed more stable behavioral responses often create a sense of psychological structure around them. Not because age automatically equals attraction, but because experience often reduces unpredictability in emotional reactions. The brain reads that reduction in unpredictability as familiarity. And familiarity is powerful. Because the mind does not always choose what is exciting, it often chooses what is easier to process. When someone's behavior feels consistent, the brain does not have to work as hard to interpret them. It doesn't need to constantly update emotional expectations. That reduction in mental effort creates a subtle sense of comfort. And comfort over time becomes a form of attachment. Now here is the part most people overlook. Familiarity does not mean repetition. It means emotional predictability within a range. A person can be completely new in your life, yet still feel familiar if their emotional energy matches patterns your brain has seen before. A calm voice, a measured response, a controlled emotional rhythm. These are all signals the subconscious mind can categorize quickly. And once something is categorized, it feels less threatening. This is why certain individuals seem to fit into your awareness without forcing anything. They are not demanding emotional decoding. They are not creating confusion. They are not triggering constant reassessment. Instead, they are offering a stable emotional pattern that the brain can comfortably map. And when mapping becomes easy, attention naturally increases. But there is another layer underneath this. The brain is constantly balancing two forces, novelty and predictability. Novelty grabs attention, but predictability holds it. Most people assume attraction comes from excitement alone, but excitement without predictability creates anxiety, not connection. The real psychological pull happens when novelty is wrapped inside emotional stability. This is where behavioral consistency becomes silently powerful. When someone responds in a steady way across different situations, the brain begins to form trust in their emotional pattern. Not trust in what they say, but trust in how they are likely to respond. This is a deeper form of cognitive trust, built over micro-observations rather than big events. And once the brain trusts a pattern, it begins to relax its guard. That relaxation is subtle but important. Because when mental resistance decreases, emotional openness increases. And emotional openness is often mistaken for attraction, even when it is actually just reduced psychological friction. This is also why people sometimes feel drawn to individuals who seem easy to read, not in a superficial sense, but in an emotional sense. The mind prefers energy it can forecast. It prefers reactions it can anticipate. It prefers communication that does not require constant interpretation, because interpretation consumes mental energy, and the brain is always trying to conserve it. So familiarity bias is not about repetition of personality, it is about reduction of uncertainty. And when uncertainty reduces, the nervous system shifts from alertness to ease. That shift is small, but psychologically significant. It changes how attention is distributed. It changes what feels comfortable. And over time, it can influence emotional preference without ever announcing itself directly. And that is the hidden truth. What feels like natural attraction is often the brain simply choosing what feels easier to understand and emotionally safer to predict. Have you ever noticed how some people don't need to say much at all, yet still manage to control the entire emotional tone of a room? They don't interrupt. They don't rush. They don't over-explain. But somehow, when they speak, people listen more carefully. When they pause, people lean in. This is not charisma in the surface sense. This is nonverbal psychology working at a deeper level than words. Human communication is far more than language. In fact, studies in behavioral psychology consistently show that tone, pacing, silence, and emotional regulation often carry more weight than the actual words being spoken. The subconscious mind is constantly decoding these signals in real time, forming impressions before logic even has a chance to intervene. This is why two people can say the same sentence, but create completely different emotional reactions. Tone of voice, for example, is one of the strongest subconscious indicators of emotional state. A calm, steady tone signals internal control. A rushed or unstable tone signals emotional urgency. And the brain is always evaluating urgency versus stability. Not because it is trying to judge character, but because it is trying to determine emotional safety. Stability lowers internal alertness. Urgency increases it. This is where patience becomes quietly powerful. A person who does not rush their responses is signaling something deeper than confidence. They are signaling emotional regulation. They are showing that they are not controlled by immediate impulses. And in psychological terms, impulse control is often interpreted by others as maturity. Not because of age, but because of emotional consistency under pressure. Now consider silence. Most people underestimate silence because they associate it with emptiness. But in psychology, silence is not empty. It is loaded with interpretation. When someone is comfortable with pauses, it tells the observing mind that they are not anxious to fill space. They are not dependent on constant validation. And that absence of pressure creates mental breathing room for others. In that breathing room, something subtle begins to happen. The other person's mind starts projecting more meaning into the interaction. Not because something is being forced, but because the absence of noise allows interpretation to expand. And human beings naturally fill emotional gaps with meaning. This is why calm presence often feels deeper than it actually is on the surface. It gives the mind space to think and feel at the same time. Now, emotional restraint is another overlooked factor. When someone does not overreact, does not escalate emotionally, and maintains composure even in uncertain situations, it creates a sense of predictability. And predictability in emotional behavior reduces psychological tension. The nervous system relaxes when it does not have to constantly prepare for unpredictable reactions. This is especially important in interpersonal dynamics. People are naturally drawn to emotional environments that feel manageable. Not dull, but manageable. There is a difference between emotional intensity and emotional instability. One feels alive, the other feels unsafe. And nonverbal communication is often what separates the two. Even small behaviors, like how long someone holds eye contact, how they pause before responding, how they listen without interrupting, become data points for the subconscious mind. These data points are not analyzed logically. They are felt. And feeling often shapes attraction more strongly than reasoning ever can. Over time, these subtle signals build what we might call an emotional impression profile. This is not about looks or status. It is about how someone feels to be around at a nervous system level. Do they create tension or ease? Do they increase mental pressure or reduce it? Do they feel unpredictable or grounded? And here's the deeper shift most people miss. Attraction is not always about excitement. Sometimes it is about relief. Relief from emotional noise. Relief from unpredictability. Relief from overstimulation. When someone consistently provides a calm emotional field, the brain begins to associate them with that relief. And association, over time, becomes preference. So what looks like simple communication is actually a layered psychological exchange happening beneath awareness. Tone becomes influence, silence becomes presence, patience becomes strength, and emotional control becomes perceived stability. And in that quiet space between words, human connection is often shaped far more than we realize. Have you ever experienced a moment where you thought you were simply observing someone, but later realized your mind was actually studying them more deeply than you expected? Not because they did anything dramatic, but because something about them felt mentally different. This is where psychological curiosity begins to take over, quietly, subtly, and often without any conscious awareness. Human attraction is not always driven by desire. Sometimes it is driven by curiosity. And curiosity, in psychological terms, is triggered when the brain encounters something it cannot immediately categorize. When a person behaves in a way that does not fully match the patterns we are used to, the mind does not rush to conclusion. Instead, it pauses, it observes, it analyzes, because uncertainty activates attention. This is why some individuals naturally hold attention without trying to. They are not necessarily more attractive in a conventional sense. They are simply less predictable in a structured way. Their behavior does not break social rules, but it also does not fully fit into familiar mental templates. And when the brain cannot fully label something, it keeps it open in memory for further processing. This open loop is important because the human brain dislikes unfinished cognitive patterns. When something feels incomplete, the mind keeps returning to it, almost like a background process running silently. This is known in cognitive psychology as the Zeigarnik effect. Unfinished impressions stay mentally active longer than completed ones. And in human interaction, this can make certain people feel more mentally present than others, even after they are gone. Now, consider emotional presence again, but from a different angle. When someone is calm, composed, and not overly expressive, they do not immediately satisfy the brain's need for full interpretation. Instead, they create layers of ambiguity, not confusion, but depth. And that depth triggers observation. The mind begins to ask silent questions. Why are they like this? What is behind that calmness? What do I not see yet? This is where curiosity becomes emotional, not just intellectual. Because once the mind starts trying to understand someone, it starts investing attention. And attention, when sustained, often gets mistaken for emotional interest. But in reality, it is cognitive engagement trying to resolve incomplete information. Another powerful layer is contrast. The human brain is highly sensitive to contrast effects. In environments where most people behave in predictable, emotionally reactive, or attention-seeking ways, someone who behaves with restraint and control stands out. Not loudly, but distinctly. This contrast does not demand attention. It naturally attracts it because it breaks expectation patterns. And expectation violation is one of the strongest triggers for curiosity. When reality does not match prediction, the brain increases focus. It pays more attention to gather more data. This is not emotional yet. It is neurological. But over time, repeated attention can evolve into familiarity, and familiarity can evolve into emotional association. This is also why silence or emotional control can sometimes feel more interesting than constant expression, because constant expression leaves nothing unresolved. But controlled expression leaves space, and in that space, the mind begins to project meaning, imagination, and interpretation. Humans are meaning-making machines, and when information is incomplete, they fill the gaps themselves. But here's the deeper truth. Curiosity is not about the other person alone. It is also about how they make you think about yourself. When someone's presence causes you to reflect more, observe more, or question your own assumptions about people, they become mentally significant. Not because they are trying to be, but because your mind is actively engaging with them on multiple levels. And the more mental engagement increases, the more emotionally present that person feels in your awareness. Even outside of interaction, even in silence, even in absence, because the brain does not fully separate thought from feeling. It blends them into experience. So what looks like simple curiosity is actually the beginning stage of deeper cognitive involvement. The mind is not just watching someone, it is trying to understand them. And in that process, attention deepens, memory strengthens, and emotional interpretation slowly begins to form. And that is where curiosity quietly transforms into something far more lasting than expected. Have you ever wondered why sometimes a single presence can feel more powerful than a long conversation? Not because anything obvious is happening, but because something inside you feels settled. Like your mind is not rushing, not analyzing, not resisting, but simply existing more calmly. This is where most people misunderstand attraction completely, because they look for it in actions, when in reality it often begins in emotional resonance. Attraction is not always desire in the beginning. Sometimes it is simply the nervous system recognizing ease. When someone's presence does not create internal conflict, the brain experiences a subtle reduction in tension. And that reduction feels like comfort. Comfort then feels like familiarity. And familiarity over time becomes emotional significance. This is how human perception slowly builds meaning without conscious decision. The deeper truth is that the brain is constantly evaluating emotional environments. Every person we meet creates a psychological field through tone, behavior, expression, and energy regulation. Some fields feel chaotic, some feel stimulating, and some feel grounded. When someone consistently creates a grounded emotional environment, the mind begins to associate them with internal balance. Not excitement, but balance. And balance is often underestimated because it is quiet. Now, here is something important. Emotional presence is not about intensity. It is about stability of attention. A person who is fully present in conversation, who listens without interruption, who responds without emotional urgency, creates a very specific psychological effect. The other person feels seen, not pressured. And when people feel seen without pressure, they naturally open up more, not because they are forced, but because they feel safe enough to do so. This is where subconscious association begins to form. The brain links certain individuals with emotional relief. And emotional relief is powerful because it reduces cognitive load. In a world where people are constantly overstimulated, the mind naturally gravitates toward what reduces effort rather than increases it. So attraction, in many cases, is not about pursuit. It is about relief from mental noise. Another layer is identity reflection. When someone carries calmness, maturity, or emotional control, it often causes others to reflect on their own internal state. Not consciously, but subtly. They start noticing how they feel around that person compared to others. And this comparison creates awareness. That awareness becomes attention. and sustained attention slowly builds emotional importance. But perhaps the most misunderstood aspect is this: people do not always respond to others directly. They respond to their own emotional state in the presence of others. If someone feels calmer, more stable, or more grounded around a person, their brain begins to assign positive value to that experience, not to the individual alone, but to how they feel internally in that interaction. This is why presence matters more than performance. Because performance is external, but presence is internal. Performance can impress, but presence can regulate emotion. And emotional regulation is one of the strongest unconscious drivers of human preference. Over time, these subtle experiences accumulate. A calm tone here, a steady reaction there, a moment of patience instead of urgency. And the brain begins to build a silent profile, not of what the person is doing, but of how it feels to be around them. That feeling becomes the foundation of perception, and perception becomes meaning. So when people talk about attraction as if it is simple, they miss the hidden architecture underneath it. It is not a single signal. It is a collection of emotional impressions layered over time, processed quietly by the subconscious mind. And most of it never reaches conscious explanation. Because in the end, human attraction is not just about who stands out, it is about who makes the mind feel most at ease without even trying.